Captain Sarah Mitchell sat in the dimly lit briefing room, her notes spread neatly in front of her. The projector flickered with grainy satellite images of mountain ridges and dusty roads, the kind of terrain she knew better than anyone. She cleared her throat softly, trying to find the right moment to speak. The colonel paced at the front, voice clipped and confident as he outlined troop movements for the week. Sarah raised her hand. "Sir," she began, her tone respectful but firm. "Based on recent chatter and convoy activity, I'd recommend a precautionary recon flight. Just one F-16 pass over the canyon tomorrow could confirm if." The colonel cut her off with a bark of laughter, the kind meant to sting. "We don't waste fuel on nervous flyers, Mitchell. Sit tight and let the real missions run." A ripple of chuckles rolled through the room. One lieutenant leaned back, muttering just loud enough for others to hear. "Maybe she can recon the filing cabinets instead." More laughter followed. Sarah's cheeks burned, but she stayed composed. She lowered her hand, her eyes fixed on the map. She knew what she saw. She knew the canyon wasn't safe. But once again, no one listened. The sting lingered into the following afternoon when she found herself at the range, standing near a group of infantrymen who were running live fire drills. She carried her helmet under her arm on her way to Inspector Jet. The sergeant leading the exercise caught sight of her and smirked. "Careful, Mom. Don't strain yourself. Leave the war to the men." The line wasn't clever, but the laughter it sparked was sharp and cutting. Soldiers grinned, rifles slung across their chests, as if she were a joke dropped in the middle of their afternoon. Sarah forced a polite nod and walked past them. She didn't rise to it. She never did, but her grip on the helmet tightened until her knuckles turned white. Later that week, in the hangar, the mechanics were working over her bird, checking hydraulics and topping off the ammunition for the cannon. Sarah approached, clipboard in hand, ready to go over the checklist. One of the younger mechanics glanced up and shook his head with a grin. Why bother tuning her bird? She won't ever fly it. Another chuckled. "Yeah, keep it clean for the next pilot who actually takes it up." They thought she didn't hear. She did. She always did. Sarah signed the paperwork without comment, thanked them, and walked away. Once she was sure no one was watching, she pressed her hand against the metal skin of the F-16. The cool surface steadied her, grounded her. Under her breath, barely more than a whisper, she said, "They don't know what you can do." She repeated the ritual every time she walked past the jet, as if the words were both promise and prayer. The reports kept piling up. Sarah sifted through them late at night, highlighting details no one else bothered to connect. More weapons moving north. More intercepted chatter about supply lines. Patterns too precise to be coincidence. She built the picture piece by piece until it screamed at her from the page. A buildup was happening. An ambush was coming. She brought it up again in passing conversation, this time with a major she trusted. He waved her off, distracted by his phone. "Intelligence exaggerates all the time, Mitchell. Don't lose sleep over it." Others weren't as gentle. In the mess hall, soldiers joked openly. "If we get hit out there, Mitchell contacts for backup." The table erupted in laughter. Someone mimed typing on an invisible keyboard, head bobbing as though bored at a desk. Sarah sat a few tables away, silent, spoon idly stirring her food. She didn't react, but every word dug deep. Her sense of isolation grew heavier with every passing day. Younger pilots, some barely out of training, were being slotted into real missions. She watched them swagger across the tarmac, helmets under arms, grinning as they climbed into cockpits. She had logged more hours, knew the manuals inside and out, could thread a needle with her aircraft in the simulator. Yet she was still benched. The frustration gnawed at her, sharper each time another name was called instead of hers. At night, she walked the hangar when it was empty, her footsteps echoing against the concrete. She stopped beside her F-16, ran her fingers over the rivets, and whispered again, "They don't know what you can do." It wasn't just habit. It was survival. Those words reminded her she was more than the mockery, more than the dismissal. She would be ready when the moment came. But the mockery didn't fade. It evolved. The laughter that once rang openly in rooms began to shift into whispers. She'd walk past groups of soldiers and hear her name drop low, followed by hushed chuckles. Some began to doubt openly whether she could handle herself in combat. "I wouldn't want her covering my unit," one muttered near the motor pool. "She'd freeze." Whispers turned to uneasy glances when she entered a room. People laughed less to her face, but the doubt hung heavier in the air. It was almost worse, suspicion replacing open ridicule. She endured it, carrying herself with calm, but inside the storm was building. The final straw came one morning in the operations center. Orders were being handed out for a major mission. Nearly 300 soldiers moving into the canyon. Sarah had studied again and again. She knew the terrain better than anyone. She knew the risks better than anyone. When the colonel listed off the air cover assignments, her name wasn't included. "Sir," she said carefully, her voice steady, "I know the canyon. I've studied it extensively. If the enemy has fortified those ridges, they'll be exposed. I can provide effective." He raised a hand, silencing her. "You're not on a roster, Mitchell." End of discussion. Her mouth went dry. She wanted to argue, to demand they listen, but the colonel's stare cut off any hope of being heard. Around the table, officers shifted in their seats. No one spoke up. No one supported her. The briefing moved on as though she hadn't spoken at all. Sarah sat frozen in her chair, her notes clutched tightly in her lap. Her mind screamed with the certainty of what was coming, but her lips stayed closed. She had been ignored too many times before. Later that day, she overheard the same officers joking outside the ops center. One shrugged, lighting a cigarette. "If things go south out there, we'll just write the loss report." Another laughed. "Yeah, good thing Mitchell's around. She can draft it up quick." The laughter stung, sharper than before, because this time the stakes were real. This wasn't just about her pride or her place in the hangar's pecking order. This was about lives. 298 of them. Soldiers were walking straight into the trap she had predicted, and command didn't even see it. Sarah clenched her jaw until it hurt, turned away, and walked back toward the hangar. Her F-16 sat there, silent and waiting, the sun gleaming off its worn skin. She rested her hand against it again, eyes shut tight. "They don't know what you can do," she whispered once more. But she did, and soon so would everyone else. She pulled a notepad from her drawer and scribbled one line. "If you're reading this, I acted because 298 lives mattered more than orders." She tore the page loose, folded it, and slid it into her locker. The canyon erupted in chaos. Dust clouds rose like choking smoke as enemy fire poured from the ridge lines. 298 American soldiers were pinned in the bowl below, rifles cracking against overwhelming odds. Mortars rained from above. Ammo was running low. Panic clawed at the edges of every radio transmission. "Three sides hot. We're boxed in," a desperate voice shouted over comms. Another cut in breathless. "We've got wounded piling up. We can't hold this line much longer." In the operations center, officers stood frozen around glowing monitors. The colonel barked for updates, but no one had real answers. Dots representing friendly forces flickered on the map, surrounded by swarming red. Reinforcements were too far. The ridge lines made standard air strikes impossible without endangering the men trapped below. "We can't risk air support inside 100 meters of friendlies," one major insisted, voice tight. "It's too close, too dangerous." The colonel cursed and slammed his fist onto the table. "So what do we do? Let them die." Silence hung heavy. Nobody offered a plan. Nobody wanted their name attached to failure. Yet everyone could see the truth written in red across the screen. Those soldiers were running out of time. On the far side of the base, away from the noise of the ops center, Sarah Mitchell sat at her small desk. The reports she had warned them about had all come true. She could almost picture the canyon in her mind. Every ridge, every fold in the terrain, every danger she had circled on her maps. Her chest felt like it was being crushed. Then she stood steady and calm and walked toward the hangar. Her F-16 waited, fueled, and armed from its last check. Mechanics had finished their work hours ago, assuming it would sit idle yet again. Sarah moved with purpose, every action deliberate. Flight suit on, helmet in hand, checklists run by memory. Oil, Hydraulics, fuel pressure, armaments. Her hands moved like water over stone. Smooth, practiced, unstoppable. Climbing into the cockpit, she strapped in and pulled the canopy down. For a brief second, her reflection caught on the glass. She saw herself, not as the base did, a desk pilot, but as she truly was, ready, capable, unafraid. Her left hand gripped the throttle, and the sleeve of her flight suit rode up just slightly. The tattoo inked on her wrist. Her brother Marcus's Army unit insignia caught the cockpit light. She pressed her thumb over it once, silently. Then she pushed the throttle forward. The twin engines roared to life, shaking the ground. A few ground crew turned, startled, rushing toward the jet. By the time they realized what was happening, she was already rolling. Control tower voices crackled with alarm. "Mitchell, aboard. You are not cleared for takeoff. Repeat, aboard immediately." Sarah didn't answer. She pushed harder, the F-16 thundering down the runway. Seconds later, wheels lifted from asphalt, and the fighter clawed into the sky. Above the canyon, soldiers crouched low, their rifles spitting short bursts to conserve rounds. The air was filled with dust, gunfire, and shouts. They had all resigned themselves to dying in that bowl. Then, a new sound cut through the chaos, the unmistakable roar of an F-16 overhead. Heads snapped skyward. One soldier muttered in disbelief. "Is that?" The radio crackled alive in the trapped commander's ear. A calm, steady voice cut through the noise. "Ground unit, this is Falcon inbound. Mark your position with IR. I see you." The commander grabbed his mic, voice cracking. "Whoever you are, keep firing. You just gave us breathing room." Sarah angled in. The canyon unfolded beneath her exactly as she had imagined. Ridge lines crawling with muzzle flashes. Heavy gun emplacements chewing into the earth where the Americans were pinned. She lined up her first run, crosshair steady. Her fingers squeezed the trigger, unleashing the cannon's roar. 20mm shells ripped across a fortified nest, erasing it in a shower of stone and silence. Soldiers below watched, stunned. The gun that had been hammering them moments earlier went still. A cheer rose, ragged but real. Sarah banked, climbing back through the dust. Her pulse was steady, her breathing even. She was doing what she had trained for in silence, what she had whispered to her jet every night, showing them what she could do. Another run, another burst. Enemy fighters scattered, their arcs of fire broken. In the chaos, a soldier glanced skyward and whispered, "Angel." Sweat trickled down her back, but her voice on the radio never wavered. "Ground unit, shift left. I'll clear the ridge." Her bursts opened corridors of survival, each one carving seconds that stretched into lifelines. In the operations center, disbelief turned to hushed awe. The same officers who had once laughed now watched the radar feed, unable to deny what they saw. One pilot alone, defying orders, saving hundreds. The general came back on comms, his voice less commanding, more human. "Whoever you are, Godspeed. Finish it." Sarah didn't respond. She didn't need to. She lined up again. The battlefield, her canvas, precision, her brush. Every dive, every squeeze of the trigger was a gamble with death. But to the men below, she was no longer the quiet pilot mocked in hangars. She was Angel, guardian of the doomed, rewriting the outcome of history with each thundering pass. By the time the sun dipped lower, the canyon had transformed. Where there had been chaos, there was order. Where there had been despair, there was hope. Soldiers moved again, no longer caged, but advancing, protected by the relentless shadow overhead. The woman they had once dismissed as fragile was flying like no one else could, and 298 lives now depended on her, refusing to stop. The first helicopter appeared through the haze, blades chopping the smoky air as it descended toward the battered canyon floor. Dust exploded outward in a violent circle, swallowing soldiers as they rushed forward. Arms reached up, pulling the wounded aboard, shoving ammo crates aside to make space for bleeding men. The trapped commander's voice crackled through radio waves, no longer frantic, but steady. "Shock 1 is loading. Keep them covered. Above Sarah's F-16 arced gracefully. She scanned the ridge lines, eyes sharp, fingers poised over the trigger. Any muzzle flash, any sudden movement, and she would end it before it threatened the evacuation. For the first time that day, she heard something new in the soldiers' transmissions. Joy! Angels away, the commander called. Cheers rose faintly, even through the roar of rotors. Another helicopter swooped in, settling into the dust cloud. Sarah dove low, unleashing a precise burst that silenced a gun crew, daring to take aim. The men below saw it. They knew someone up there had decided their lives were worth the risk. One by one, the helicopters lifted, each carrying soldiers who hours earlier had resigned themselves to dying in that canyon. Not a single one was left behind. Not a single life was lost. When the last bird rose, wobbling under its heavy load, Sarah pulled her F-16 higher into the sky. She circled above until the canyon was empty of Americans and filled only with silence. Then she banked toward home. Back at the base, news spread faster than official channels could contain it. Mechanics, medics, clerks, infantry all knew something had happened. Something extraordinary. They crowded near the flight line, eyes searching the horizon. When Sarah's F-16 appeared, a small dot growing larger against the evening sky, a hush fell over the gathered crowd. The fighter touched down with barely a sound, rolling to a stop near the hangar. Sarah climbed out slowly, her movements deliberate, unhurried. She pulled off her helmet, her hair matted with sweat, her face marked by the imprint of her oxygen mask. For a moment, she stood beside her aircraft, one hand resting on the wing. The crowd watched, waiting. Someone started to clap, then another. The sound grew, spreading through the gathered personnel until it became a thunderous roar of approval. Sarah didn't acknowledge it. She simply walked toward the hangar, her steps steady, her expression calm. But those who knew her well could see the difference. The woman who had been mocked, dismissed, ignored, now carried herself with quiet dignity. She had proven what she always knew, that when it mattered most, when lives hung in the balance, courage wasn't measured by rank or recognition. It was measured by the willingness to act when action was needed most. The applause followed her all the way to the hangar door. The next morning, Sarah was summoned to the colonel's office. She walked through the corridors, expecting the worst. Court-martial, perhaps. Discharge. The end of her career. But something had changed. Soldiers she passed didn't look away anymore. They met her eyes, some nodding respectfully. A few even stopped to shake her hand. "Thank you, ma'am," one young private said quietly. "My brother was in that canyon." The colonel's office felt different too. When she entered, she found not just her commanding officer, but several higher-ranking officials, including a general she'd never seen before. Sarah stood at attention, waiting for judgment. The colonel cleared his throat, his voice lacking its usual edge. "Captain Mitchell," he began slowly, "what you did yesterday was a direct violation of orders. You took an aircraft without authorization, ignored direct commands from the tower, and engaged in combat operations outside the chain of command." Sarah kept her eyes forward, her voice steady. "Yes, sir. I understand the charges." The general stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Captain," he said quietly, "those charges would normally result in immediate court-martial and dismissal from service." Sarah's heart sank, but her posture remained straight. "However," the general continued, "the results of your actions have complicated matters significantly. 298 American soldiers are alive today because of your decision. Not one casualty. Not one." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. The families of those men, the media, Congress, they're all asking the same question. How do we punish the pilot who saved nearly 300 lives? Sarah remained silent, unsure how to respond. The colonel looked uncomfortable, shuffling papers on his desk. "There will be an investigation, of course," he said. "Your actions will be reviewed, protocols examined. But as of now, you remain on active duty." The general added, "Your knowledge of that terrain, your tactical assessment, it was all correct. Command failed to listen. That failure nearly cost us 300 good soldiers." But paperwork could never erase what everyone on that base had witnessed. A pilot who refused to let nearly 300 Americans die. Stories in the mess hall repeated the tale in hushed tones. "She flew within 50 meters of our guys," one soldier said. "Suicidal, but not a single blue casualty." Another shook his head in disbelief. "She changed the whole fight." Higher command eventually conceded what the moment had already decided. New training modules were written. Danger close restrictions were re-examined. Sarah's improvisation became a case study in survival, not recklessness. Doctrine bent, not because she sought glory, but because she had shown what was possible when lives mattered more than rules. And Sarah, she remained herself. She still ate quietly in the mess, still traced maps late at night, still touched her F-16's metal skin before each flight. She carried no swagger, no new arrogance, only a deeper calm. Weeks later, she walked past the operations center where a new map had been mounted. Red markers dotted canyons across the region, danger zones, and in one corner, someone had drawn a fresh line in black ink, curving through the canyon that should have been a grave, but had become a path home. It was the exact line Sarah had flown. She stopped studying it. Soldiers passed by, some nodding respectfully, some pausing to touch the map as though it were sacred. Sarah smiled faintly, not for herself, but for what it meant. Proof that silence could still shape history, that courage could redraw the map. The changes rippled outward. Intelligence reports that had been dismissed were now scrutinized more carefully. Junior officers found their voices heard where before they had been silenced. The culture of dismissal that had nearly cost 298 lives began to crack, replaced by something more open, more willing to listen. Sarah had not just saved soldiers that day. She had saved the institution from its own arrogance. The rigid hierarchy that demanded blind obedience learned that sometimes the most important voices came from the most unexpected places. Months passed, and Sarah's story spread beyond their base. Military academies began incorporating her mission into their tactical studies curriculum. New protocols emerged that balanced chain of command with operational necessity. The Canyon Incident, as it became known in official documentation, represented a turning point in military thinking about individual initiative versus institutional authority. Sarah found herself invited to speak at staff colleges, her quiet demeanor a sharp contrast to the dramatic tale she had lived. She spoke not of heroism, but of preparation, of the importance of studying terrain, of listening to intelligence patterns that others might dismiss. Young officers hung on every word, not because she was dramatic, but because she was real. The mechanics who had once mocked her now competed for the privilege of servicing her aircraft. The same F-16 that had sat idle for months became a symbol of readiness, its maintenance logs scrutinized to ensure peak performance. Sarah still performed her ritual, touching the metal skin before each flight, but now others watched with respect rather than mockery. The canyon itself became a pilgrimage site of sorts for military personnel studying close air support tactics. The ridges where enemy positions had been eliminated were marked on training maps. The exact flight paths Sarah had flown became required study for pilots learning precision engagement techniques. What had begun as an act of desperation had evolved into doctrine. Intelligence officers across the theater began adopting Sarah's methodical approach to pattern analysis. Her technique of connecting seemingly unrelated reports became standard practice, preventing future ambushes before they could develop. The dismissive attitude toward careful analysis that had nearly proven fatal was replaced with institutional respect for thorough preparation. Sarah's influence extended far beyond that single mission. She had not just saved 298 lives in one day. She had changed how the military valued expertise, regardless of rank or recognition. The quiet voices that had been ignored now found audiences willing to listen. The woman who had once whispered to her aircraft in empty hangars now found her voice heard in the highest levels of command. But Sarah never forgot the isolation, the mockery, the nights when doubt crept in and threatened to silence her completely. She understood that her story was not unique in its beginning, only in its ending. Across military bases around the world, there were others like her, experts dismissed by those who confused authority with wisdom, voices silenced by those who mistook rank for competence. Sarah made it her mission to find them, to listen when others would not. She established informal networks where junior personnel could raise concerns without fear of ridicule, where careful analysis was valued over comfortable assumptions. The quiet revolution she had started with a single flight continued in conference rooms and training facilities, changing not just procedures but culture itself. Years later, when asked about that day in the canyon, Sarah would always return to the same theme. It wasn't about disobeying orders or breaking rules. It was about understanding when human lives outweighed institutional protocols, when moral courage demanded action despite personal cost. The 298 soldiers who went home to their families represented more than a successful mission. They represented the triumph of competence over politics, expertise over hierarchy, individual conscience over institutional inertia. Sarah's legacy was not found in the medals or commendations that eventually came, though they did come. It was found in the countless decisions made by military personnel who remembered her example, who chose to speak up when they saw danger, who refused to let bureaucracy silence their expertise. The quiet pilot who had been mocked for caring too much had shown an entire institution that caring was not weakness, but strength. Her brother Marcus's insignia, the tattoo she still touched before every flight, had become a symbol not just of personal loss, but of the responsibility that came with knowledge. Every flight was a promise to use her skills not for glory or recognition, but for the protection of those who trusted their lives to her competence. The narrator's voice rose in the silence of that thought. History isn't changed by those who follow rules blindly, but by those who act when lives are at stake. Sarah Mitchell had been mocked, dismissed, left in the shadows. But when the moment came, she rose. And because of her, 300 Americans went home alive. The desk pilot no one wanted had become a warrior everyone needed. One woman, dismissed as too weak, proved that courage is measured not in rank, but in sacrifice. She turned silence into strength and doubt into history. Her actions remind us that when lives hang in the balance, true character is revealed not by orders, but by the will to act. On quiet evenings, when the base settled into its routine rhythms, Sarah would still walk the flight line. Her F-16 stood ready, its metal skin gleaming under the hangar lights. She would place her hand against the fuselage, feeling the solid reality of the machine that had carried her into legend. But she no longer whispered, "They don't know what you can do." Now, she whispered something different. "We know what we must do." The difference was everything. It spoke of responsibility accepted, of expertise acknowledged, of a community that had learned to listen to its most careful observers. The canyon that should have been a grave had become a classroom. The woman who should have been forgotten had become a teacher. Sarah Mitchell's story spread beyond military circles, inspiring anyone who had ever been dismissed for caring too much, for seeing too clearly, for refusing to accept that things must remain as they were. Her legacy lived not in the headlines or the official reports, but in the quiet decisions of individuals who chose competence over comfort, who spoke truth to power, who acted when action was needed most. The 298 lives saved that day multiplied into thousands as her example rippled through an institution that learned to value expertise wherever it was found. History would remember the day a dismissed pilot defied orders to save nearly 300 soldiers. But those who truly understood would remember something more important. The day the military learned to listen.